All right, here we go. It's the System Failure Podcast, number 36.
36? Is that really the number? We are getting up there, huh?
We sure are.
Well, Brian, how are you doing this week?
We're doing okay. I mean, we're lamenting the loss of the Bruins.
Yeah, you said it earlier. So when it rains, it pours on the podcast front, and we have a lot to get into this show. But yeah, first, I think a mournful dirge for our lost Bruins season, huh? Having lost their elimination game 6, the Boston Bruins are retired from the playoff bracket, and we're left with no sports concerns to follow at all, other than the lazy currents of the Red Sox season, up till the Patriots take the field again in September, eh?
Well, there's going to be nothing to do but focus on overthrowing our reptilian overlords.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it is always fun. This was a great year for us because we went down to Game 7, and you really renew your faith, your dedication to the faith of the Bruins, going to one of these crazy playoff barn burners. So that was nice. Overall, the Bruins' 100th centennial season was pretty good, and you can't feel too bad when your team makes it to the second round of the playoffs. It's not as if the Bruins didn't have their fair share of excitement, but they won't be making it to the Final Four, and so one of the remaining teams will be the Stanley Cup champion this year. So it'll be interesting to follow the New York-Florida series as it progresses, and we'll see who eventually wins the Cup. But yep, it was a great year all in all. It was really fun going to that Game 7, and we did get to go to the Rangers with our dear friend the captain back in March too. So yeah, it was an all right Bruins season for sure. Hard to feel too sad, eh?
Yeah. All right. Well,
as mentioned, the Podcastsphere is chock-a-block full since we last recorded here, and there's so much to get to. It's gonna be hard to jam it all into just a mere hour. But I think probably the one of the new up-and-comers in the podcast realm is our man, the libertarian Dave Smith, who's made the rounds on Rogan before, but was featured on Tucker Carlson this week, so that's always a major, given the numbers that Carlson gets, that's always a major, he's going to get in front of a lot more eyes, even more, it's not, I'm sure that Rogan has a bigger following than Tucker, but these are heavy hitters in the podcast, so Dave Smith has vaulted to stardom here in the past 12 months. He's also going to be debating Chris Cuomo on the 31st on the Patrick Bet David pod, which is interesting. As folks who are listening may or may not be aware, Chris Cuomo, former CNN news anchor and brother to former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and son, both he and his brother Andrew, of former New York Governor Mario Cuomo. And we all remember the excitement during the COVID era, during the darkest days of the COVID era, when the shrill yentas on The View were heralding Andrew Cuomo as the COVID hero and possibly suggesting he might run during 2024. Remember that the ladies in The View were calling themselves the Cuomo-sexuals? And then, of course, Andrew Cuomo, turned out he was... what was it that he did with respect to nursing homes? He locked down nursing homes, or he didn't remove people who were sick from nursing homes or something. But most importantly, Andrew Cuomo's political career collapsed in a series of Me Too scandals, each more eyebrow-raising than the last. And Chris Cuomo, his brother, was shamelessly having him on CNN during the aforementioned darkest days of the COVID era to bang on about the importance of this lockdown or that vaccination. And anyway, all that collapsed in what Chris Cuomo since shit-canned from CNN. And is now trying to join the podcast, the one of the pirate ships. He's joined Patrick Bet David's Podcastsphere. What do they call it? Infotainment? Is that what is Patrick Bet David's company called? Something like that. So now Chris Cuomo wants to be welcomed with open arms into the rebellious renegades on the podcasting circuit, and so he's agreed to debate the aforementioned Dave Smith on May the 31st. That should be entertainment, eh, Brian?
Well, I think Cuomo isn't he vaccine injured and
Yes.
taking the horse paste now?
That's his most recent thing. He's come around to the renegade side because he got hit with a vaccine injury, and he's taken his doctor has him on ivermectin. So yeah, he who had formerly referred to ivermectin as horse paste. So that's very amusing. Now it was the ivermectin thing was especially odd for me because Tracy and I, my fiance Tracy and I, were in South Africa in 2021, and we were in one of our Airbnbs we were at for a month in Hout Bay, which is one of these the southernmost district within the Cape Town metropolitan area. And our Airbnb hosts and their entire family were stricken with COVID. Now, they were in a separate building from us. We were in some out building, so we didn't have any. Neither Trace and me nor the German couple who were staying in the downstairs apartment in a totally detached building ever got sick. But this family got sick, and they just naturally, casually in passing, mentioned that. And this was before ivermectin became a huge source of contention here stateside. They just mentioned casually in passing that, of course, they got sick, so they went to their cupboards and took their ivermectin, and now they're feeling much better. For those guys, in South Africa, there's like malaria, there's like serious diseases in Africa. So for them, ivermectin is just a normal medication, like our profens or aspirins that people just have in their medicine cabinet, and that was their natural reaction to contracting COVID, was to hit up those antivirals. So I don't know how effective ivermectin really is specifically against COVID. Not really. I've seen some studies reference that suggest it is effective, and others that suggest it doesn't have much effect at all. And who knows what to believe? But the idea that it's horse paste and should be that people would take it in response to getting COVID is ridiculous, or quackery, or someone who's obsessed with alternative medicine or all this. I mean, it's just. Obviously, it's a Nobel Prize winning drug, and it's really common in Africa. So now Chris Cuomo is on that ivermectin, and he's got a vaccine injury, and he's no longer, now that he's no longer hammering those CNN paychecks, he's no longer hammering the establishment consensus on the COVID front, and so and he expects to be, as I mentioned, welcomed by the other renegades. Now that he wants to, be like the man from Pirates of the Caribbean here, Admiral Norrington, and just join the pirates. But Dave Smith is like, well, hold on a second, because you had all kinds of wrong opinions. We don't just get to forget that you were parroting talking points from the establishment. Well, on the podcast sphere, people turned out to be all like recently acknowledgement that COVID really did evidence that COVID has been actually did matriculate in a lab versus in some kind of a wet market has been making the rounds lately, and we all remember when it was racist to suggest that the lab might have arisen from the Wuhan Institute of Virology versus some nearby wet market with bats and pangolins.
Well, I would imagine that Cuomo is going to go on there and try to say that they're making the best judgment they had with the information available at the time, and that he's not a Nazi.
Yeah, well, he was making the best information he had with the Pfizer advertising dollars at the time, right? That's what, and I'm sure I don't think he knows who Dave Smith is. Like, Dave Smith knows his foreign policy cold, and he's like a major libertarian voice, and so he was right, of course, on all the crazy COVID policies. And now that all the damage that lockdowns and the total lack of efficacy of masks and the lack of efficacy of the vaccines is now exposed, turns out Dave Smith was right all along, and Chris Cuomo was wrong all along. So I don't think Cuomo knows what he's getting into. That will be very interesting on May the 31st. So I'll definitely check that debate out. That really, maybe it'll be cathartic, but things that you hope are going to be cathartic rarely turn out to actually be so. But maybe this could actually be the genuine article.
Well, what did you think about Dave Smith's appearance on Tucker?
Well, that's I was excited to see. Dave Smith had a podcast announcing his debate, and then at the very same time, within the same morning I was seeing that, which was I think Thursday morning, his appearance on Tucker dropped, which was awesome. And actually, I do have Dave. Just to set I have a quote. I have a clip that we are going to play from Dave's appearance on Tucker Carlson, and it's only about 30 seconds long. And it touches on a bunch of different long-standing themes here at System Failure, but overall, we had our friend the Libertarian on this pod, last month, or maybe it was the month before, and I can totally appreciate the Libertarian notion of assuming we need zero government and then building it out from there. Like, well, let's assume we need no kind of government and then add back the necessary pieces. So you find, and I've heard Dave Smith make a libertarian argument for closed borders, which doesn't seem very libertarian. But the idea is like limited government, not massive walls and patrols and border security, right? So the libertarians you'll hear them advocate for ideas like a border wall, or like making sure that the list of ingredients is stamped on every food packaging, and people go to jail if it's not stamped on, which doesn't really seem like limited government. That seems like like a heavy regulatory regime. But it's really it's not a question of policies being good or bad. It's about a question of the quality of the regulation, right? There's a spectrum of regulatory quality, and the libertarians just assume that all regulation is bad without acknowledging that quality. And that's why they are successful politically, because the anti-tax lobby will get behind the libertarian cause when they want taxes written down. But you'll never hear from the libertarian lobby when it comes time to decide whether or not to go to war or to have bank bailouts. That's just the libertarian lobby is totally ignored. So that's where Dave Smith is coming from, and so let's hear him talking on Tucker now. Brian, if you will play the clip. Again, we'll play it for about 30 seconds, and then we'll be off to the races here.
Believable to me that particularly like people like like Bernie Sanders types will say that they care so much about working people and they want to do whatever they can to help these working people, and yet the biggest bill for working people is their federal income taxes.
Oh, I know.
And I mean the IRS. I mean, I know stories from good friends of mine. They are ruthless. I mean, they go back 20 years and ruin people. And this isn't just like, it's like people kind of have this idea that there's like economic issues over here and social issues over here as if they're different, but they're really not. I mean, you go back 20 years on somebody and say, a guy who's making 30 grand a year.
Okay, well, that's the clip there. Just the two things that the part that really jumped out to me is when Dave says, social issues and economics are connected, which is really interesting. They later will talk about a civil war in the political left in America, mostly igniting since this Gaza business took place in October of 2023. But they'll also talk about the proliferation of how you can like search, you do run an analysis on search terms on Google and the major search engines, and you can see the prevalence of like woke search terms exploding in the early 2010s, right in the aftermath of Occupy Wall Street. And I think that's really a big part of what. That's the best way to understand the political landscape we're faced with today in America. On the left, right, like there's the tension between corporate profit and the public good that Bernie Sanders wants to slide that in the other direction, or he wants to sacrifice some corporate profits but goose the public good, because we've been sliding the other direction for so long. And this is but the Democratic establishment accepts its political donors since Clinton, no longer from the labor unions but from the corporations themselves. So both the Democratic and Republican wings of our political system are beholden to the same corporate donors, and they're literally being paid to prevent moving that slider away from corporate profits and back towards the public good at all. But of course, that's exactly what is desperately needed in this country, and why Bernie Sanders was so overwhelmingly popular in 2016 and 2020, and why the Democratic establishment had to cheat to remove him from our array of possible Democratic options. And I think that the proliferation of woke search terms in 2010 really illustrates the point, because in the early days of the Barack Obama administration, we had Occupy Wall Street and people holding signs saying we are the 99% and we're against the 1%. Screaming out in front of the investment banks in Wall Street about all of the wealth. I think it was Matt Taibbi that described 2008 as like a couple dozen people on Wall Street raking in billions while the rest of the country all got poorer. And that's exactly what our response to 2008 was. And then the public's response to that feckless political response was to be out in front of the investment banks just screaming at these bankers. And it was the rise, right, you could see the logic, right? We'd had a revolution in gay rights in the years leading up to Barack Obama and the early years of his presidency. And we'd had the what you could call maybe the final boss of the civil rights movement electing a black president. You could just see that the idea the Democrats had was to carry those kinds of identity politics forward, right? Create a massive division among the poor peasants who are out in front of the investment banks with their pitchforks and their torches.
Right. Well, like the election of Barack Obama poses like a problem because it was like framed as like the end of racism, right?
Yeah.
And on 4chan, they were posting memes of 52 or 53 white presidents and then Barack Obama and being like combo breaker. And they had to get back in there and try to figure out how to make that a problem again.
Yeah, right. It's like the abortion issue, right? The abortion issue, like there's a right. It's like Barack Obama ran on codifying abortion, right? Codifying Roe v. Wade into law. But as soon as he got into power and had a supermajority in the House and a majority in the Senate, right, he couldn't. They just did nothing because that's a really important political football. They always needed. They couldn't retire that political football. They always knew, like an aged quarterback, they were going to have to send it back in to play at some point here. And that's exactly what's happened. It's the only thing that like it's become a major issue in the 2024, and it's become a minor issue in the upcoming 2024 election. Abortion has, right? The Democrats will never. They need to have abortion in play. They'll never codify it into law, and they rely on people thinking that they have people's actual best intentions at heart, and not that. What people don't realize is things like abortion and gay rights and trans rights, and these are all they want incandescent debate where in this arena where it's not going to hurt the balance sheets of the wealthy, right? There's not going to be any reform. There's not going to be any tax reform or any financial reform on Wall Street. It's just going to be more of the same. So,
well, I think the emphasis on the Donald is an important part of what they're doing because they just have to make the Donald seem like a bigger catastrophe than the DNC. Yeah,
the Donald's uniquely evil, so just don't mind the fact that the DNC is for forever wars and won't be helping you at all financially. It's just that the other guy is evil, so we've got to. And they did manage to drag their octogenarian candidate across the finish line in 2020 using that rationale, which was a real morale killer. From in 2016, when the Donald got elected, even though I agreed with exactly zero of his policies, it was like, well. This is a common recognition that something is wrong, and so it felt really good. In 2016. It was a big morale boost for yours truly anyway. And then 2020, the Dems got rewarded for cheating in their primaries and for stifling Bernie. And I was like, well, that means it's going to be a long time before they adopt a strategy that's not cheating in their primaries and shafting Bernie. It's interesting to note that I like how Dave Smith, coming from the libertarian angle, is able to see that social issues and economics are connected. And then the other things that he mentioned there is that we're broker than we've ever been, right? And so that really leads into our discussion last week of Stephanie Kelton and the modern monetary theorists and the religion that surrounds our national debt. I mean, obviously we went through it all last week, but you could the national debt is the other side of it's the government debt, but the other side of government debt is private savings in the private sector. Before every economic collapse, you can see whenever the government pulls money, whenever the government balances its budget and pulls money out of the private sector, like during the Clinton years, you find that there's a recession soon or a depression soon thereafter, right? So like the dot-com boom after the Clinton years. Running a balanced budget like Clinton did is a total disaster for the economy because if the government is taking in more money than it's giving out, that means that it's destroying savings. So you could look at the debt clock and say, well, yeah, that is the government debt, but that number also represents private savings, and so the number goes up all the time, terrifyingly, right? And conveniently, if you're one of these political bodies that wants to make sure that we cut spending so that we don't have, so that we can lower taxes slash taxes to the bone. Well, then fear mongering about the national debt is a great way to justify slashing spending. But it's really a measure of the amount of savings that's in the private sector, and so the fact that it keeps going up all the time, really, it shouldn't concern us the way that it does. Now, there is definitely an issue with printing money, or you can definitely get yourself into an inflationary situation by printing money, but the actual money is not the problem at all. The problem is we've got a limited set of goods and services, but we have an infinite amount of money we can print. It's like inches or seconds or degrees of temperature. You can have as many degrees Fahrenheit as you need to measure the temperature outside. You don't need to be limited in your degrees Fahrenheit.
Well, it seems like you can use this. I mean, I think when Dave Smith says we're in a hole, or we're broker than we've ever been. Well, certainly we're borrowing more money from the rich than we ever have.
Right, but we don't. That's unnecessary, right? You could print the money without borrowing from the rich.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think anyone would think the national debt was a problem if the government spent its money on people.
Yeah, if we didn't go to war, and give tax cuts to the wealthy, and we instead ran budget deficits for the public good. Yeah, that's what I think that it's certainly true that the Federal Reserve is a crooked and corrupt organization, and that the way that it works is by is when there's too much, when we haven't taxed enough cash away from the rich people, and there's too much money in the economy, and we're seeing inflations. The solution the Federal Reserve has is to increase rates so that business activity dries up and workers are punished and laid off and they stop buying things. And that's how, you just punish workers, and that's how to get inflation down versus taxing the extra froth off the rich.
Well, so I feel like you're saying that this national debt number, isn't necessarily a huge catastrophe. And I guess if the national debt was money spent on people, then we'd probably be living in a lavish paradise, right. Unparalleled. But that's not the case, and it is a huge catastrophe. So I don't think that Dave Smith's point is, too unreasonable.
Well, he would just say that the Federal Reserve we need sound money. The Federal Reserve is an example of too much government, and we could just have free markets. And there is this mythology. Like every religion has this mythology, and the mythology in our religion in America is that first there were people living in hunter-gatherer or perhaps early agricultural times, and that these people needed a way, like let's say you're really, really good at making bows and arrows, but now I'm really, really good at hunting, right? You need furs to stay warm in the winter. I need bows and arrows to do my hunting. And so we find we have a double coincidence of wants. And so now we can create, using a third commodity, we can create an exchange rate between hides and bows and arrows, right? And that will allow distribution of labor and civilization is off and running. But the reality is that, the mythology here is that early people bartered because they didn't have money, right? Then they invented money, right? And then they were able to facilitate exchange through a double coincidence of wants. And then from there, you get financial markets and like debt and all of the other financial instruments that we're used to, right? That story should sound familiar. But really, there is no anthropological evidence at all that people resorted to barter in the time. The only time you find people bartering is when they had money, and then for some reason the money disappears. Then you find people bartering, right? The way that early people before money did business was with that piece of mythology makes a silly assumption, and that assumption is that there's no such thing as credit, right? What really happened is that you have bows and arrows, and I have furs. But we're really unlikely to need them at the same moment, right? That double coincidence of wants is really unlikely. But what you would do is just give me some bows and arrows on credit, right? You would say, well, now you owe me, right? And this really is a moral intuition we all have when it comes to debt, right? We all understand borrowing a cup of sugar from your neighbor, and the impulse that you definitely want to make sure you have something for your neighbor when they're in want, when they need something, right? And that moral intuition is used to get us all to, pay our student loan debts to these huge faceless corporations, because you feel like if you have a debt, you ought to pay it. But that is the mythology is really that the mythology is that barter comes second, and that that debt is much older than money is, right? We had the concept of the debt. You started with debt, and then eventually you had money, and then from there you go to barter versus barter to money to debt, right? We have our mythology has the history of debt exactly reversed, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, I mean, it's. I think money and taxes have to do with funding armies, right? Isn't that
right? This is right. The money comes into play when you're Alexander the Great, and you need to, right. It's not Alexander the Great wants to pile up resources and gold and wealth, right? But why stamp his face why stamp his face on the coins? Like why take gold, which is valuable, and then stamp your face on it? And the reason is that what you do is you distribute these coins to, right? This gets to the core of modern monetary theory, right? You distribute these coins first to your soldiers, and then you tell everyone else, the rest of your society, that they owe you some of these coins at the end of the year, back in taxes. So Alexander the Great is only going to accept coins with Alexander the Great's face stamped on them in taxes. He's not going to accept gold without his face stamped on him, and that's going to give him control. You're never going to have control over all the gold, but if you only accept taxes in gold with your face stamped on it, then that means that people have to get some money from your soldiers in order to get the gold to pay you, right? And since only your soldiers are the only ones with coins with your face stamped on them, that means that the weapons makers and the armorers and the prostitutes and the restaurants and the inns and taverns are all going to have to do whatever it takes to get these gold this gold off of the arm, these gold pieces away from the army soldiers, and then so they can turn them into you at the end of the year to avoid execution for tax arrears, for falling behind on their taxes. And then of course but that kind of economy means that your army needs to keep conquering city after city so that you can take the gold that's in that city, melt it down, and print up those coins with your face on them, and then pay even more soldiers to conquer even more cities, right? It's an economic plan that has to keep expanding. But you can see how money pops into existence in the 5th century. Well, it comes to Greece in the 5th century BC, from Lydia, from Asia Minor. Or I guess from Syria, I guess just south of Asia Minor is where the Lydians were. But at any rate, the idea that money first starts as a tax credit, and that's where money starts its life cycle. It really the thing that Dave Smith and the libertarians and the sound money people are missing is that they think that money should be made a commodity like gold or silver. Right. So when you're talking about commodity, you're talking about like the number of tape measures you own, right? Versus the inches that the tape measures represent, right? It's the inches that really matter for measuring the economy. But these guys are suggesting that we have to have gold or silver, or they want to constrain the number of inches available so that the government can't borrow from rich people out of control. They want to constrain the inches available by constraining the number of tape measures or yardsticks that are available, right? The tape measures and yardsticks are a commodity, whereas inches are a measuring tool, right? So they're really two different concepts.
Well, I think it's probably splitting hairs a bit. Or like Dave Smith is trying to figure out how to, contain this crazy beast that we have that's in control of our society, right? And so what to do when that beast is under control? I mean, if we had commodified money, if we had like a reasonable government, like people are happy to pay taxes, like in Sweden, right? At least that's what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and like Denmark, they vote themselves tax increases because they see real return in their everyday life for their tax dollars. It doesn't just go to fund tax cuts for the wealthy or foreign wars.
So once we,
bailouts for the oil companies.
Once we slay the beast there,
yeah,
I don't. It's small potatoes.
Well, you can either you can have money issued right as you can limit money.
I'll just pick it up again from once we slay the beast.
Okay. Well, there's two. Once we slay the beast, there are two ways that we can issue our money. We can just have it just be a commodity-based money, and then that just limits the. But that really that's very limiting. Which is great if your beast is out of control. But we could also have money issued as a public utility with democratic accountability, and as long as you have the proper democratic accountability, that's what really gets rid of all this regulation, right? We have for-profit companies that behave in antisocial ways to achieve profit, and we're trying to constrain them and box them in with regulations so they do the right thing. But what you could really just have is corporate entities that are democratically accountable and therefore don't need to have every possible bad behavior they could engage in outlawed, so leaving them only the one path to tread where their actions contribute to social good versus are deleterious of it. But
yeah, well, so the national debt, though, I mean, I think you would agree. I mean, it doesn't have to be a catastrophe, but it is a catastrophe, though, right?
It's not that the debt is a catastrophe. It's the fact that we owe all this money to rich people. We're going to pay $780 billion to rich people based on that debt. Well, we could monetize that debt and buy them all out by just printing the money anytime we want, right? You could just not issue any more treasury bonds and then issue the money. You could issue the money any way you want, really. Well, what matters is that the government has to put money into the economy before it can ever collect its first dollar in taxes, right? So it's a question of how you're going to outlay those dollars before you collect $1 back in taxes. You have to give out a whole bunch of dollars, as mentioned. So,
well, yeah, the problem could be solved relatively quickly if the beast were slain.
Yeah, it's not a complex issue to solve. We have a whole fugazi surrounding it, and a whole Federal Reserve system that makes it complex and difficult to figure out how we're creating money and destroying money. But yeah, so interesting stuff. And so that makes me think of the clip you sent me earlier this week, where the venerable Professor Wolf popped up on Jimmy Dore, right? And he was talking about Stephanie Kelton and her movie that we talked about last week.
Should we
Finding the Money.
Should we play the clip?
All right, well, put it on, man, if you want to. I have the...
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do?
Sounds like me.
They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? So they sell bonds, and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing. But there is no question that the government prints money, and then it uses that money to I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Well, anyway, that extremely unsatisfying answer, right? It's this Biden official talking about how like the lending works, and just nothing could be more on the point than that, eh?
Yeah, in Stephanie's movie, Follow the Money, that's an actual clip from it. That man is Jared Goldstein. He's the literal counsel, the chair. Excuse me. He's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he has no idea how our economic system works. Right? Because it's our religion. It's just this convoluted, made up set of ideas that isn't really true, and he's trying to remember what the canon says, but it doesn't really make any sense, right? Because he either has not had the realization that the government the government must print first before it collects any taxes, right? It's not collecting taxes and then spending out of the taxes it collects. It's spending money and then collecting taxes out of the money it's spent, right? You just have to get oriented. But yeah, there is no reason when we can print infinite dollars. There is no reason we need to borrow dollars from rich people. It's like there's this monopoly, like money creation, money. We all need to have money. We need to deploy money from the future. That's what finance really is. If you go to the bank and get a loan, they're going to give you access to your own money from the future for a price, right? And they can charge the price because the banks have a monopoly on the issuance of future money. And the Federal Reserve is part of that banking structure. And, well, I forgot where I was going with that. Hang on. I just forgot where I was going with that exactly. But it's interesting that we have this religion surrounding currency issuance. Like no one really understands. It's such a simple concept that you have to first give out U.S. dollars before you can collect a single U.S. dollar back in taxes. But we've got this whole mythology built on it where people are terrified of the national debt, and that fear mongering, of course, is a strategy to gin up support for cutting taxes. But it just leaves people in this. It's like when the DNC and Hillary and the Democrats said that Donald was an agent of Moscow and put all of this energy into that idea, and then didn't have any way to resolve it at all. So everyone just kind of left with their eyebrows up on their forehead, wandering around as if something horrible has happened, but then it never really resolved that way, and there's no real way to unwind that sort of notion once you put it out there. And so it's interesting to see that so much fear mongering, in a parallel fashion, is put out there regarding the national debt, but that never really resolved. So just year after year, people are in a panic state about the national debt. But right, we can have a difference between there has to be, by definition, there has to be a difference between the amount of dollars the U.S. government first puts out there and seeds in the economy. They can only collect a small fraction of that back in taxes in any given year, and so running a budget surplus is a bad sign for our money supply.
Well, if you're looking for some indication that like we're in a cult, that lackluster answer from that Biden official is you can see through it like grandma's underpants.
Yeah. There's the cult has like symbolism to it, like the eye of Horus that's on the back of our $1 bill, but you can also find that it's all over Prague for whatever reason, that Eye of Providence, or you can find it in the Supper at Emmaus portrait at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It's really interesting to see that once the banks started taking over the top spot in the international relations hierarchy, they took it over from the popes, who themselves took it over from the Caesars, that they have they even though they cloak themselves in secrecy, that they still have like symbols they use to refer, like the religion has a symbology to it. So anyway, the modern monetary theory, I think it's like I think it's the closest thing to a reformation we have in our religion of finance and capitalism. It's like
what do you mean it's the closest thing we have to a reformation?
It's the closest thing to a body of opposing ideas, right? You have like the standard orthodoxy, and then you have a heterodoxy that opposes the orthodoxy, and so all of these educated people who comprise the modern monetary theory community have a heterodox idea that's directly opposed to the orthodox idea that's currently held by everyone who has power in our society.
So who's in the heterodoxy? Like this person,
Stephanie Kelton,
Yeah,
Richard
right.
Wolff, Michael Hudson.
Okay, makes sense.
The people who look at the system and have a different interpretation of what's going on than the propaganda that the priests at our current Federal Reserve currently propagate.
Yeah, and so the heterodoxy is growing, thanks in part to fine people like ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's what we're here to do. We gotta help the Jan Huses and the Martin Luthers and the John Wyclifs of this Reformation make their mark on history by rebroadcasting their ideas. So, yep, that's part of the game. Name of the game here at System Failure, eh, Brian?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of Tucker Carlson, Mr. Aaron Rodgers was also on his podcast this week. As you said, when it rains, it pours on the podcast front, Brian. Mr. Rodgers, of course, is most famous for being the quarterback of the New York Jets, but he also has come into prominence for being opposed to the COVID regime, and so he had all kinds of interesting little tidbits on Tucker's podcast, Brian, and you even have some notes from that particular program, so what you got? Take it away.
Yeah. I thought it was a pretty awesome interview. One thing that people don't like about Tucker Carlson is his laugh, and it is pretty fruity.
You could wean himself off of that crazy laugh. It really does sound terrible.
Although I think it is kind of a sign he's being honest. He's just being like, I don't know, like exuberant person. If he was like a shill, I think there's no way he would do the fruity laugh, right?
Well, you're right, but he could bump up his credibility 20% if you would not do that crazy laugh. But
all right. Well, anyway,
whatever.
They talked about a lot of interesting things. I just couldn't help but think about how much of a legend Aaron Rodgers is. We just needed someone to make a bold stance against. Aaron Rodgers was talking about how these like stooges came around from the NFL and we're trying to get everyone to take the injections. And and Aaron Rodgers was like asking questions, like one of the few guys doing it. But he was just like a leader. They were talking about how many people probably had like fake vaccine cards and whatnot, and like Aaron Rodgers, he was like the State Farm guy for a while there.
Yeah.
The discount double check, and he gave up like a lot of money. So yeah, he's really awesome.
Yeah, he made some big sacrifice. He didn't agree. These NFL players are like really in tune with their body. They know what they're peak athletes. It's not like they're like the people least likely to suffer and die from COVID. They're like kids, right? They're just on the lowest risk profile, right? The COVID attacks the flabby and the infirm and the elderly, right? That's who it attacks. Not people who are prime physical specimens like Mr. Rodgers. So what did he do? What did he take that was not the COVID shot, but some other thing he said he was inoculated? I can't remember. He did some alternative thing, and of course Rodgers is fine, but he said that the league there were so many advertising dollars on the table from the likes of Pfizer that the league had let them send their stooges out to every team, and they're just trying to get that 99% vax rate.
Well, Aaron Rodgers was also talking about how he did like this 5-day darkness retreat in his various, ayahuasca journeys and whatnot. And then, I started thinking about, Jesus. He does look like Jesus a little bit with the long hair and whatnot. And I was thinking about, well, Jesus being nailed up to the cross, with like a mangled body and whatnot. And, he famously says, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? And, even Jesus lost hope in the end, it seems. See, I guess I feel like, I think the system is like working because I don't it seems like Aaron Rodgers has like won, this crazy argument with the mainstream. And like, I don't know what's going to happen with Chris Cuomo or Andrew Cuomo.
Chris Cuomo. Yeah. Andrew Cuomo is firmly in the disgraced bin. He can never come back. But Chris Cuomo, he's coming back, trying to anyway.
Well, it seems like, the Twitter and the Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan and the Aaron Rodgers, I mean, these guys seem to have prevailed over our reptilian overlords, right?
Yeah. So when you say the system is working, right, can you be more specific?
Well, I mean, there is like this like cancer like within the system that like makes us want to like lose hope. And, we sometimes we're like Jesus nailed up on the cross, feeling like our Lord has forsaken us. But, I mean, I don't think the establishment like has, or our reptilian overlords like have the control that they want, right? They're like losing their grip.
Yeah. Okay. So I would. I see what you're saying. So there's the capitalist system, right? And we would hardly say that the successes of Messrs. Rogan and Carlson are triumphs of the capitalist system. It's more like they're succeeding despite the capitalist system doing everything it can to shit on them, right?
I mean, it's like the money-making power of Joe Rogan is like a big deal. Like I don't know if that like Citizens, United, this crazy court decision that said money is free speech. Like I don't know if it's really like a lot of money got donated to Bernie Sanders, which resulted in us getting the Donald, and like it's like the financial viability of Joe Rogan that's like keeping him on the air and able to do his thing. I mean, there are problems with nepotism and this cancer basically, but it seems like things are going to straighten themselves out.
Well, okay, so I agree that the human system with its sacrifice on behalf of the younger generations and its progressive waves of people and its divinity, there's something about humankind that is definitely going to triumph over these forces that want to seize control and maintain control for their own narrow enrichment. But I think that system is the prisoners are tunneling out of the prison camp through the wall, but then there's also liberators tunneling from the other side, right? Like the ideas elucidated by Rogan, they're not it's not money that's the wind in his sails. It's the fact that he's speaking honestly and truthfully. That makes his podcast so popular. The money is secondary to that, and then there's also the moneyed our apparatus of figuring out what's going on in the world, the legacy apparatus, how we all used to figure out the Walter Cronkites, the legacy media, where they've told so many lies they're just being exposed and everyone's shutting them off en masse. So I do think that I think it's like truth, reality, and human divinity is the system that is triumphing here. And that the capitalist system, right, which has two fundamental problems, right? One is that technology will obviate the relevance of workers to a system of production that uses only two roles, employer and employee, to organize the economy, right? We organize production by whacking people up into employers and employees, and that's a real problem when you have so much technology that employers don't really need employees anymore. You're going to have you will either have a system where employees just have all the wealth and everyone else scratches the surface of the earth for a living, which isn't going to happen, right? That you're going to have a couple dozen people, like Taibbi said about Occupy Wall Street. You're going to have a couple dozen people that own everything, and they're vastly outnumbered by all these people who are going to be desperate and have no means of supporting themselves. And that's just a situation that's obviously untenable. So that's why Marx would have said that the eventual communist revolution is inevitable.
I guess to characterize the system as capitalism, I guess isn't really what I would characterize it as. But I mean, capitalism is going to create the socialist revolution that Marx foretold.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the industrial capital is heading down that road, and then finance capital has a separate problem where there's always more dollars of debt than dollars of. And Dave Smith and the libertarians and the sound money people understand that, right? more the fractional reserve system is set up such that there's always more dollars of debt than actual currency in circulation. And so we're going to have to eventually figure out what to do with that debt. And either will be used as an occasion of foreclosure to, again, consolidate wealth in the hands of a tiny few, or debts are going to be written off and wealth is going to be spread around much more democratically. And obviously only the latter scenario is possible, right?
I think where the rubber meets the road is that, I've often lamented that we're going to get hit with another, 9/11-esque catastrophe because it's the only way for our reptilian overlords to maintain control, right? Yeah. And so what's going to happen when that happens next time? Because they're not going to be able to force a narrative through Twitter, and like Joe Rogan's on YouTube. Is like YouTube gonna? He must have some kind of deal with YouTube, right? They're not just gonna be able to strike Joe Rogan from YouTube, or maybe they will. But
they can try, but they'll look foolish because his full pods will still be up on Spotify and on Twitter and whatnot.
Yeah, so I don't know what they're gonna do. So yeah, I guess there is the crazy debt system that you talked about. I guess I'm not I don't know. I guess I wouldn't worry about all that stuff so much.
Well, that is the fundamental message I would like to deliver on system failure. We should be delighted. As T-Mac would always say, in times of revolution, there's music in the streets and the cafes are open all night. It's going to be great for almost all of us. The revolution, they're going to the aristocracy, the upper class is going to have a bad time. But that's the way that it works. Like if we compare this current situation to the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Reformation, we wouldn't say that the coming of the Black Death and the destruction of half the peasantry, so that the peasantry start thinking that, I can, rather than swearing fealty to this one feudal lord, I can play multiple feudal lords off amongst each other and make them bid against each other for my, to contract my labor services versus just, taking what offer you have to, just having no choice but to till the same land your father tilled and his father before him, until the end of time. But the destruction of the economic system that divided people up into lords and serfs was set in motion by the Black Death and amplified by the invent of the printing press, and then finally the discovery that the Earth is actually in orbit around the sun and not the other way around, a total paradigm shift. So none of those things I would say are like triumphs of none of those things are signs that the system is working well. The system of lords and peasants was working well. All of those things were dysfunction that destroyed that system of lords and peasants and replaced it with our modern system of employees and employers. So I just wouldn't. So the system, meaning humankind and the divinity of humanity and the way that we are, is definitely going to overcome the current system, the economic system that's collapsing. So you're right. In the broader system of humanity is definitely going to win against the limited, parochial, and temporary system of capitalism that we're confronted with. No question about that, right?
Well, if we lived in like some kind of just monarchy or a non-democratic capitalist system, just system where someone's in control, I mean, you're just at the mercy of that person. And, well, I guess, it is a problem to stay in power if you're a monarch.
But the rest of us should be glad of it, right? That's good news for the common folks, that there's all the heavy lies the crown and all that.
Yeah, well, I guess we're on the same page, and it seems. We'll see what happens. Either they're gonna have another shocking incident and be able to get the system under control, or they're gonna be embarrassed terribly. And I think it's gonna have to be the second option. They'll have to do something probably pretty horrifying.
I'll be very curious. 2024 is going to be an interesting year.
Yeah.
Well, so we compared the modern era to the late Middle Ages, but there's also a comparison to antiquity and the fall of Rome, right? The Roman system was already in a state of collapse by the time Jesus comes around, right? The Roman society got emperors as the result of a crazy class war, right? Julius Caesar seized power at the head of a political faction called the Populares, or the proletariat, and his political opponents were at the head of a political movement called the Optimates, who was like the bourgeoisie, and that conflict got so out of hand in the years leading up to the birth of Jesus, in the years leading up to Caesar's declaration, Caesar taking control of the entire empire in 47, and then getting assassinated in 44. Caesar, like as mentioned, took power as a result of this, massive class war. So the Roman period, there's 3 periods to Roman history. There's the Roman monarchy, which in 509 BC, Tarquin was the last king of Rome, and he had an idea of doing a debt cancellation, like what Solon of Athens had done 70 years prior. Solon had canceled debts in Athens and set the stage for Periclean Athens, like the golden age of Athens. And so the last king of the Romans had a funny idea where he was going to do the same thing. But they ran him out of town. There was some story about like a rape charge or something, and they got rid of the monarchy and installed the Senate, which is an oligarchy. It was like the mafia, right? The main families created this Senate. And they called it democracy, but it was really just rule by the rich, right? Oligarchic rule or plutocracy. And they had the tradition that anyone that wants to make themselves king, like Tarquin the Great, which is a code word for canceling the debts, gets executed and run out of town. We do not tolerate people making themselves king. This was a fixture in Roman culture. For 500 years, the Senate ruled without a king or an emperor. During the Punic Wars and the annihilation of ancient Greece. Right on up till the empire became huge, and there was this huge fight, between the freedom of the ruling class to just abuse and exploit the lower classes, and the freedom of the lower classes to not be exploited. And then Julius Caesar rose to power, and the reason they stabbed him was they said, he's trying to make himself king, right? He's doing some king making, and we don't tolerate that, so we got to plunge all these knives through the breast of Caesar, right? So understanding that the rise of the emperors was a result of a collapsing empire, we now snap focus over to Jerusalem, where you've got this guy Jesus, right? And we're going to execute Jesus. Why? Because he's unrolled this scroll of Isaiah from the Old Testament and is trying to forgive debts, just like Solon of Athens and like Tarquin tried to do in Rome. And when they nailed the cross, if you go to church, you'll see a picture of Jesus on the cross, and there's always the scroll. You remember the scroll, Brian? That's always nailed to the top of the cross that says INRI INRI on it.
Maybe.
Can you picture this? You'll see it now that I've mentioned it. You'll see it everywhere you go. That means that's Latin for King of the Jews, right? Jesus' name begins J. You get the soft J sound in Latin. So when they don't have Jesus, they have Iosos. So his name begins with an I. Mm-hmm. So both Jesus, there's 2 I's, right? INRI, INRI. Like R's for Rex, right? And so INRI is the Latin for its initials for Latin of King of the Jews, right? So the reason that the charge they brought Jesus up on and nailed him to the cross on was making yourself a king, presuming to declare oneself king. Well, this we can't have in the lands controlled by the Romans. So on the cross you have to go. And so it's like the word tyranny. The word tyrant became It's what the liberators of the 6th century BC called themselves when they wanted to forgive debts, but it's what the rich people they cast the word tyrant in a negative connotation, which is where we find it today. But tyranny was really the idea that a member of the unfortunate member of the aristocracy or an irrelevant member of the aristocracy would arise and use the popular power of the people to take power for himself, and to get rid of the rest of the aristocracy. And so that was what so it's just an interesting when you look at the history of the Roman Empire and like what Jesus really meant in the context of that history. So would we say that the public demonstration of Jesus, that the government has no control over him, and that he's willing to be nailed to his cross, and that nailing him to the cross is only going to make his cause grow faster, all that ballsy public demonstration, or the bound book that carried his message across the Mediterranean theater for the first time. Neither of those things we would say are triumphs of the old Roman imperial system, right? There's just that the Roman imperial system is way out over its skis, that it's an ethical disaster, that the brutal tax regimes they're imposing on the entire known world were like unfair and confiscatory, and that its destruction and eventual crumbling wasn't a triumph or a feature of the system itself, but a triumph or a feature of the human divinity, or the whatever it is about humans that makes us always trying to improve things, always trying to invent the next big thing, always moving forward in time, moving on up the ladder of progress.
Well, I think there's just a bit of a difference in that, like YouTube and Spotify, these are in Twitter, are like features of the system, and so Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson and Aaron Rodgers and others are taking advantage of that.
Well, it's an example of technology. The very thing in the Marxian prophecy that Andrew Yang would always say, we didn't know, he drives me nuts. He would always say, we didn't know that capitalism's offspring technology would kill it. And I was like, we didn't know that because I'm pretty sure that volumes 2 and 3 of Capital by Karl Marx were published in 1892. I feel like we really should have known that. It's like in the literature and has been for a long time now.
That is funny.
Yeah. It's like we didn't know, but...
All right. Well, I guess just the other thing about Aaron Rodgers is, just thinking about the archetypical nature of the story. And I guess that probably... Well, it's just that there's a little bit of Jesus in all of us that shows up like when we need it, right? And so we have our comrade who set themselves on fire. I don't know if he agreed about if I agree with all his points, but broadly speaking, he's trying to shed the truth of, shed light on what's going on. And I'm sure he probably lost his faith as he was being burnt to a crisp at some point there. But, I'm sure he is... Well, we just, like Jesus lost his faith on the cross, but we think of like Jesus as like one with God, sitting there at his side or whatever. And I don't know, people step up in times of need. It's like the human story, right? And so like Aaron Rodgers did that. Like, he didn't really get crucified like Jesus did, but he obviously took some character attacks.
Lost his State Farm deal. I can't imagine how many millions that was worth.
Quite a few, I'd imagine. And so I mean, it's like this hyper true story, right?
Yeah. There's the world where you like decide to make a fist to ball your hand up into a fist, and then there's the world where the fist is actually made. Or they're two completely different realms. And it's really stopped ever since I started thinking archetypically. It's really stopped becoming a question that matters whether or not Jesus exists in the world where you actually ball your fist up, right? Because that's only a secondary or derivative or lower order reality than the place where you decide to make the fist, right? The mental realm. Like you're like most of the things that go on inside your head do not appear in the 4D matrix we're living in at all. But Jesus, along with James Bond and Darth Vader, live in that mental realm for sure. They're definitely real there, and it's amazing how powerful, how much. Like Vader and Bond, they bleed a little bit over into the real world. Like they're influence. Like maybe you're picking out a pocket square and you're like, well, what would James Bond choose? But Jesus has like, even if he doesn't exist in a corporeal form and has never existed in the realm where you ball your fist, where your fist actually is, he's had an unimaginable impact on it one way or another. And I think that is what we should be noticing, and that the archetypical, the Jesus' existence in the archetypical realm is the only important existence it's the only one that matters, right? Yeah.
And I guess to go back to what we were talking about before and the system working is that there's just this lesser matrix that's like this thing of like gloom and doom, and that they make you want to lose all hope and whatnot. But there's this greater matrix within which, Jesus resides or something, or well, I mean, it just, in times of strife, I don't know, people step up and get nailed to the cross, apparently. And it seems to be working, just based on, we just seem to be, the forces of good seem to be overcoming the forces of evil here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels good, and not like it was in 2020. So we'll have to see. The Empire, I'm sure, is planning to strike back here before the election in November. So I will be fascinated to see what they've got for us, huh?
Yeah. Well, it will be interesting just to see if they're going to somehow let RFK win. He's beating the other guys in the polls, right?
Yeah. So the way that it works is one-on-one RFK beats Biden, one-on-one RFK beats Trump, but in a three-way race, the Donald wins and beats both RFK and Biden. There's no Biden winning, at least in the way the polls look now under any scenario. The guy's a disaster. It's only a three-way race. A three-way race hands it to Trump. So that's why Kennedy is trying to pressure Biden to drop out. Or what they had, like he challenged, his latest stunt was challenge Biden to a nationwide poll in like July or August, where they both agree that these polls will be neutral, and then whoever's ahead gets the Democratic nomination instead of because RFK's point is that trying to if Biden doesn't drop out, then that's if the goal is to not have the Donald be president, then you want RFK to run. So interesting times, man. Interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what say we put a bow on this episode of System Failure then, Brian, and we will look forward to rejoining our audience next week. But obviously, it's the bottom of the show, so I have to encourage that audience to go ahead and sign on to nop.substack.com if you want to read some exciting essays about all of the topics and issues that we are always bandying about here on the pod. And if you want to send us an email and give us your personal opinion, why we shall most certainly read it on the air. That email is nop@substack.com. So the two addresses you need to remember are nop.substack.com. And not at substack.com. That's nice how that all works out, eh?
All right, yes.
All right, everyone. We'll see you all next week.
All right.